some source of water, that could also be a problem. Starvation, certainly, for the same reasons. And finally, the elements, the weather. We saw a lot of rain here yesterday, Joey. Some places that may have otherwise been air voids could have unfortunately been flooded, and that's certainly something on the minds of people who are out at Ground Zero trying to find some of these bodies. All those things are certainly obstacles, but as I said, there is a degree of optimism that we're still seeing amongst the doctors, amongst the rescue workers. Every time an ambulance pulls up behind me here, everyone's looking to see if maybe there's a survivor that has been pulled out from Ground Zero, and certainly there's a lot of people here still looking for that. Joey.
We're all eager to hear that. Dr. Sanjay Gupta from CNN's medical unit. Thanks very much. Wolf?
Thank you. Joey.
Let's check our top stories. As of this moment, President Bush today declared the United States is at war. He called on the United States fighting men and women to stand ready. He also warned the United States is fighting a new enemy on a battlefield without defined boundaries. Rescue efforts at the Pentagon and in lower Manhattan continue today. In New York, as the rubble and debris is cleared, the death toll rises. And the New York Fire Department honors 3 fallen leaders. At the Pentagon, U.S. officials begin to measure the damage and estimate the cost of rebuilding. One preliminary figure from Reuters places it in the hundreds of millions of dollars. In Manhattan, fire and rescue operations continue. New York firefighters laid to rest a few of their own. Funerals for Fire Chief Gonsi and First Deputy Commissioner William Feehan were held today. They were among the hundreds of firefighters killed in the Twin Tower attacks. Fire Chaplain Michael Judge was also buried today. Joey?
On Monday, the New York Stock Exchange will ring its opening bell once again and begin trading for the first time since Tuesday's attacks. Question, though, that remains, how have the attacks affected the U.S. economy? You get the latest from CNN's Greg Clarkin of CNN Financial News. Greg, what are the expectations for Monday?
Well, at this point, Joey, first and foremost, folks are just relieved that trading will begin on Monday. It's a significant event, not only for the impact on the economy here in the U.S. and the world markets, but also very deep and symbolic value for the U.S. Now, Dick Grasso is the chairman and CEO of the New York Stock Exchange. He said he really wanted to get trading up running as soon as possible after they tested the systems at the NYSE in Lower Manhattan, and that's exactly what technicians there did for a few hours this morning, going over the various infrastructure, the various telecommunications, voice and data networks at the exchange to make sure that no bugs would be found and that things could get up and running smoothly so that members at the exchange as well as brokerages off-site could be able to communicate and process trades and execute orders on Monday morning. So all systems were go today. The tests proved very successful. The NASDAQ also conducted tests throughout the day, and they termed results of their tests terrific. Now, as for the impact of trading, a lot of folks are expecting to see at least an initial sell-off in the markets. You have to remember there's a lot of companies, a lot of industries that will be especially hard hit by this tragedy. First and foremost, the insurance companies as well as the airlines. You're expected to see heavy selling in that. And then after that sell-off, where things go at this point remains a point of debate. A lot of folks are urging prudence and some calm to the markets on Monday, basically to restore a sense of stability to the equity markets. Now, as for Grasso himself, he says this prolonged shutdown of the stock exchange may actually benefit things.
Investors have had this time frame to step back and take a reasoned approach, take a thoughtful approach to their investments, to what this event has meant to America. And I'm hopeful that that will return a rationality to otherwise what would have been an irrational resumption of trading.
Now, as for other aspects of this tragedy, the New York Stock Exchange, located just a couple of blocks east of the World Trade Center, has the logistical problems to deal with. They've been working very hard with the city to ensure that the thousands of folks that work on that floor at the New York Stock Exchange, as well as in administrative positions at the NYSE, will have access to the financial district. They're confident that there will not be a problem on Monday. When those folks do get to the NYSE, they'll find very stringent security as expected. They'll also find counselors to treat trauma as well as surgical masks for any problems with dust particles in the air and so forth. So it will be an interesting day of trading, Joey, and this is one that a lot of folks are looking forward to, just to restore some sense of stability to Wall Street.
Right, Greg, I get the impression that Wall Street really would like to send a signal that it is back in business and ready to go. I wonder also, I understand that there is an offering from the Fed to try to stimulate our thinking about the economy and moving forward there as well.
Exactly, Joe. There's a lot of talk about a possible action from the Federal Reserve in the way of a rate cut and so forth. And that's, again, just at this point, a lot of things are being considered, a lot of things being talked about, all again with the end goal of basically hoping to resume some normal, or what passes for normal, at least on Monday, and some stable trading in the equity markets. Again, a lot of apprehension over just how things will go technically with that infrastructure system, the data and voice network, as well as kind of emotionally, the emotional aspect of trading as well.
Right. You talk about the emotional aspect of trading, and I wonder if you could relate that specifically to the smaller investor. I understand what the corporate investor's psychology is, but what about handling the small investor, those of us individuals who might have money that we're wondering about and worried about here?
Sure, Joey. At this point, large and small investors, really the markets in general just do not like instability, national, global instability, anything along those lines. It tends to rattle people, and that's why a lot of folks believe that the prolonged shutdown, the 4-day shutdown, may actually have given a lot of investors, small investors, enough time to kind of digest and process the events, see how the overseas markets reacted. They sold off initially, and there was a lot of choppiness there, but they did stabilize towards the end of the week, and that may give a lot of folks encouragement here. But again, at least early on, there's a kind of a consensus that you can probably look for a bit of a sell-off. And again, you're going to see those industries that are hard hit, the insurance companies, the airlines, which at this point are really being battered. We've already seen Midway airline go out of business. So there's a lot of feeling that those industries at least will lead the downside, lead the selling on Monday. And then again, after that, there's a lot of folks calling for kind of a sense of calm and kind of caution in the marketplace.
From CNN Financial News, Greg Clark, and thanks very much. And again, the stock exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, will ring its opening bell Monday morning at 9:30. Thanks very much, Greg. Wolf?
Joey, news organizations have spent an enormous amount of time and spent a great deal of energy covering the story. I want to check in with CNN's Howard Kurtz of Reliable Sources and the Washington Post, get a sense of how we're doing. How is the news media, the major news organizations, how are we doing?
Well, unlike other big stories, Wolf, of the O.J. or Monica or Chandra Levy variety, where there was so much sensationalism and hype, on balance, the media coverage here has been serious, it's been sober, it's been pretty sensitive. With a couple of exceptions, which I'll talk about in a moment, I would say that journalists did a terrific job of processing real-time information that was just unthinkable, unimaginable to so many of us as it was happening, as the tragedy was unfolding. And I think television, too, has served as kind of an electronic hearth around which the nation could gather, look at the familiar anchor faces to find out what was going on, what the repercussions were, and maybe to begin the process of healing.
What were those glaring mistakes that you were referring to?
Well, understandable perhaps in all the confusion. We had the morning of the tragedy reports about a car bomb exploding at the State Department. On Thursday, there were these hopeful reports on all the cable networks, ABC and CBS, about 5 people discovered in the rubble at the World Trade Center. It turned out to be a couple of firefighters who had fallen into a hole a couple of hours earlier. And on Thursday night, there were widespread reports about some of those detained at JFK and LaGuardia airports in New York having been armed with knives. My newspaper, the Washington Post, ran a banner headline about armed. Turns out they didn't have any weapons. I think also some viewers have been a little bit turned off at the constant replaying of the horrifying footage of the planes hitting the World Trade Center, not in news reports, but in bumpers and logos and even in split-screen shots when other people are being interviewed. I think there's a sense that to see it that often, to see the buildings falling, to see the people dying, kind of dehumanizes and maybe even trivializes the event. It would almost be like television showing JFK getting killed again and again every 5 minutes in 1963.
Is it too early to conclude that journalism, as you and I know it and practice it, will be changed as a result of this coverage that we've seen these past few days?
It's certainly not too early. We've seen it this week with the broadcast networks losing $100 million a day in revenue to cover this story in a serious and comprehensive way. And I think, too, there'll be more focus on the president as a wartime president. Perhaps there was less focus when the budget battles that didn't seem to engage a lot of Americans. There'll be a lot more coverage of military, global terrorism, intelligence. And I think, too, there may be some clashes ahead, Wolf, between the military and journalism, as we saw in the Gulf War, as news organizations report some information that may be embarrassing to our military and intelligence establishment in this new war. So in other words, we'll be testing the limits, and I think there's a lot of public sympathy with the administration as it tries to fight this war. I think the challenge for journalism is to get serious, but also to maintain its independence and not become an arm of the government.
Well, that raises a serious question. Is there a fear that in all the emotion and the anger, the depth of the feeling right now, that that journalists like all of us could get carried away and become sort of jingoistic in our coverage as opposed to being the objective observers that we're supposed to be?
I think that's a legitimate concern, particularly as the events fade a little bit and we get into this long, protracted situation. A journalist shouldn't be flag wavers, and journalists should certainly be respectful of national security. I want to be very clear on that, but at the same time, they need to report aggressively because the Pentagon, the CIA, and others who will be involved in this conflict are not always doing the perfect job, as we saw in the failure of intelligence in the original attack. So I think it's going to be a fine line for journalists to walk. They may lose some public sympathy, but they've got to maintain their independence and not become, as you say, jingoistic.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but despite the internet, despite everybody going to the internet, television journalism still was the place most Americans went to immediately and stood with it for hours and watched for hours and hours at a time.
That is true. The internet has served a vital purpose, but I was walking down Connecticut Avenue in downtown Washington, and I saw crowds of people gathered outside electronics stores to watch the coverage on television. It really was one of those times when television, for all its flaws, for all its excesses, despite the dwindling audience, really brought the country together. Everyone was watching, everyone was talking about it, and I think under the circumstances, there were some mistakes, there was some excess. Under the circumstances, television has stepped up to the challenge.
And you said that there's a reassurance that the American public gets from seeing familiar figures on television. Talk about that. We know in the 60s, Walter Cronkite was Uncle Walter, and everybody was reassured when they saw him after the John F. Kennedy assassination. Is there a similar process underway right now?
Well, when you have people like Peter Jennings or Dan Rather on the air for 12, 18 hours at a time, I think that does give people a sense that they are seeing people who are their friends who come into their living room, and also the grieving process. These anchors showed some emotion. They didn't just sit there and read off the prompter. This was a horrifying event for everybody, including news people. And I think as we see people being buried, as we see the rubble, as we see the victims, the anchor people, the correspondents have played a really important role in leading the country through this very difficult time.
Walk us through the next few days or weeks, if you will. Anything we should be looking toward specifically?
I think we're going to see President Bush covered round the clock already. Ari Fleischer has asked us not to report on his advanced movements for obviously security reasons. I think we're going to see news organizations ramping up in terms of their coverage of the Pentagon. We're going to have to learn a lot. You may already know it, but much of America doesn't, about Afghanistan, about Pakistan, about the global implications here, about Islam. So I really think this is the greatest challenge that journalism has faced in a long, long time. So far, I think the job has been pretty good. Given the excesses of past big stories, I'm not entirely confident it will remain that way, but if it doesn't, I'll let you know.
All right. Howard Kurtz of Reliable Sources, CNN's Reliable Sources, and the Washington Post, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf.
And one of the many people killed in Tuesday's devastating terrorist violence was former federal prosecutor and conservative commentator Barbara Olson. Friends and family gathered today in Virginia to memorialize Barbara. She was one of the passengers aboard American Airlines Flight 77 that was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. Before the plane went down, Barbara called her husband and described what was happening. Ted Olson, the Solicitor General of the Justice Department, says his wife was not crying and didn't even sound frightened. Friends say that was indicative of Barbara, a woman who strided boldly through life.
Barbara's spirit survives in each of us, just as the spirit of our great country lives on. She lives in our memories, now dampened by tears and made hazy by grief. But she's here, her ever-present high heels clicking across the floors of this cathedral and through all the passageways of our sentiments.
Barbara Olson, a good friend to all of us here at CNN. Joey?
Less well known, but certainly respected, loved by the city of New York, deeply respected there. Hundreds of mourners gathering to pay their respects to three leaders in the New York City Fire Department killed in the line of duty on Tuesday. Among those, William Feehan, the first deputy commissioner of the New York Fire Department. Also, the New York City Fire Chief Peter Gansey, a 33-year veteran of the department, He was killed battling the flames that erupted after two hijacked planes tore through the Twin Towers and were laid to rest today. The New York Fire Department chaplain Michael Judge is known to many as Father Mike. He was killed as he administered last rites to one of the firefighters. A somber day of memorials in New York City. Meantime, the work continues in Lower Manhattan. CNN's Gary Tuckman is very close to the World Trade Center site, and he joins us now. Gary.
You know, Joey, this is not the first time an airplane has smashed into New York City's tallest skyscraper. The date was July 28, 1945. A U.S. military plane lost in the fog smashed into the 79th story of the Empire State Building, which was then the tallest building in New York City, and ironically, once again, is the tallest building in New York City. 14 people were killed when that happened. Now, for many New Yorkers, particularly those over 60 years old who remember that, it was deja vu when they were watching television and saw the first plane smash into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. People thought it was an accident, but a few minutes later, when the second plane came in, they realized this was much different. The only things these incidents had in common were that aviation equipment smashed into tall buildings. And now, many New Yorkers, 4 days later, are starting to get used to the fact that this terrible thing has happened in their city. Behind me, where the World Trade Center complex used to stand, there are fires still burning. There is smoke still steaming. You may be wondering, why can't they put the fires out? What happens is they put a fire out, then they raise steel and metal. It provides oxygen to an area, and more fires start, and that's the scenario. The bad news, no survivors have been found today. No survivors were found yesterday. No survivors the day before. But, and this is very important, many officials here still believe, and they're not just saying this to make people feel better, they still believe there's a possibility that people could be alive. They believe people could be 60 feet below all the wreckage. The problem is they just can't get to it. A very heartening sight I saw just a little while ago, about 8 blocks away from here, that's about a half a mile away, on the corner of West Street and Canal Street. That's the place where the public's allowed to be right now. They can't be any further south than that. There's about 500 to 700 people standing, cheering for the rescue workers as the rescue workers leave this restricted area. This isn't like an organized celebration for these rescue workers. It's not like a Yankee parade after they win the World Series where people know to come somewhere at an appointed time. These are people who have just decided to show up and thank the workers who have worked so hard to try to find survivors. Joey, back to you.
Gary, let me ask you, because I have read that New York has turned into something of a very, very big, very small town, that there is sort of this outpouring of strangers trying to help out other strangers in the midst of this crisis. It's certainly not, frankly, the image that we generally associate with New Yorkers.
Well, I'll tell you, I used to live in New York City. I lived here 10 years. Yes, I did. And I find that New Yorkers are much more friendly than people give them credit for. But I will also tell you that I've never seen a more friendlier time than the past several days.
This area also of Lower Manhattan, much of it has been closed off, as you have said, with the emergency efforts underway in that area. But there is some residential around there, isn't there? And some of those people have not even been able to return to their homes?
That's exactly right, Joey. And what's happened is people are given the opportunity to go to their homes for a short amount of time, to take animals, to take things they need in the house, and then they're encouraged to leave the area. If you are stubborn about it and want to stay in your home, they will let you, but pretty much it's vacant in this area right now.
CNN's Gary Tuckman, very close to the World Trade Center site where the work does continue. Gary noting that there was still a sense of hope that there might be still people who are surviving, still need to be rescued underneath as well. I should note that we heard from Dr. Sanjay Gupta at one of the hospitals in New York saying that the emergency workers there believe that there is still a chance, still holding out the best of hopes for those who might still be trapped alive in the World Trade Center rubble. Wolf?
And Joey, for all those people in New York, clearly with time, it does not get any easier at all. For now, thanks so much for watching. I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington.
And I'm Joey Chena at CNN Center in Atlanta. A little more perspective and views of what might be ahead for America in its new war. Now from the Capitol Gang.
Welcome to Capitol Gang. I'm Mark Shields with the full Capitol Gang. Al Hunt, Robert Novak, Kate O'Byrne, and Margaret Carlson. Partisanship was laid aside as President Bush and Congress quickly doubled the $20 billion emergency appropriation.
I particularly want to thank the President and the staff of the White House, the OMB, who understood our request.
We could quibble for days or for weeks. We could argue the legalisms. We could parse over every word. But the Senate, united, like I have never seen it before, chose not to do that.
But in the House late last night, emergency aid for distressed airlines was blocked by the objection of Democratic Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Texas.
Tonight, before all the bodies are removed, before the dust is settled, before perhaps all the fires are extinguished, there are those that are lining up here at the Capitol door at the public treasury asking that they receive some public subsidy right out of the Social Security fund.
We have airline industry on the verge of collapse. And if we don't lay down a mark in the sand and say, yes, we're willing because of action of our government, back up those airline industries for the loss of monies, they will start going down.
Tougher security was imposed in the nation's capital and at airports.
We will discontinue curbside check-in at the airport, and passengers will be required to go to the ticket counters to check in.
We are a free people, and the purpose of terrorism is to terrorize. It's to alter behavior, and to the extent free people have to alter their behavior, they're no longer free.
Bob Novak, is our freedom being curtailed?
Yes, it is, and it isn't a question of making sacrifice. I don't understand how abolishing airport check-ins at the curbside hurts the terrorists at all. I don't understand how closing down Reagan Airport, National Airport, perhaps permanently, hurts the terrorists at all. And I don't understand how making life more difficult for Americans enabled us to win this war. But there's something more important than that, and that's the economy. We're not producing any automobiles in this country right now because you can't get the airbags, which are all made in Europe, to come in. There are no automobiles being made, and I really believe that it isn't a question of a greedy airline. It's these airlines, which are vital to the American economy, may go under, and it's just outrageous to talk about this nonsense about a Social Security fund as a reason for not bailing them out.
Margaret, in the rubble of Tuesday, what other casualties do you see?
Yeah, well, we've lost a few other things than our economic health. There was a looming recession anyway. 350 firefighters, those people who run back into burning buildings and not away from them, and 50 policemen. Any sense of safety or certainty. 5,000 people, none found today. And we proceed without any sense that it's over. And I think the freedoms that some freedoms we are going to have to get up. Pennsylvania Avenue's never going to be reopened now. Is the cost of trying to deal with that. Bob's right, curbside check-in isn't going to do much, and airport security, it's like a cliche of journalism to get onto the tarmac. But Bush said today, he let the word out that he wants the football games and the baseball games to come back and to play as soon as possible because he does want the world to go on and for, as Rumsfeld said, us not to be giving in to terrorists by not living life.
But we've been endlessly told, Mark, in a distant time, you're more likely to be hit by lightning than you are to be killed by a terrorist. Well, I don't have a friend who I've ever lost through a lightning strike, but I have a dear friend who a terrorist has now murdered, and there are thousands of Americans who've now had that same experience, dear friends and family murdered by terrorists. So that's one canard we won't be hearing any longer. And it struck in America in a way none of us could have ever expected. As a result, in some part, perhaps, to a colossal intelligence failure. One of the things, Mark, that obviously people are going to be looking into in the weeks ahead. I don't know if there's an institutional problem with our intelligence services, whether or not the liberals have so stymied them in the kinds of methods they can use. Is it a lack of resources, although they get $30 billion a year? But that's just one of the many things that Americans are going to be asking, I think, when they begin getting over the shock and heartbreak of this week.
Al Hunt.
Mark, I think you have to make a distinction between inconvenience and maybe even impositions and basic infringements. And I think that's what we have to be very careful about over the next couple months. I think making airline travel harder, tougher, longer in this country is an imposition. I don't like it, but so be it. We're going to have to be like LL. If we're going to have a war on terrorism, it really requires a war on terrorism, and we're going to have to do that. And people, it's going to be inconvenient. What is a real issue, and not just a matter of convenience, is things like more wiretapping. You know, what kind of infringements are we going to have on Americans? And I think that's a very real issue. Finally, I would say, Bob, you may be right about the airlines. I don't know, but darn it, the House of Representatives shouldn't pass that in 34 minutes. If we're going to be handing out multi-billion-dollar bailouts, let's have hearings, let's talk about it, let's act on it. God bless Lloyd Doggett. He was right.
I think he was very wrong. I think this was only an authorization. It wasn't an appropriation. No money came out, but it would give a boost to them to start operating again. I think Continental Airlines could go under because of this. And I really believe that if we have a meltdown of the great American economy because of these bloody terrorists, of course, Margaret, we mourn these brave firemen and policemen. But if they have succeeded if they bring this economy to its knees. And I think we're in a very dangerous position right now where we have, for security reasons, closed down the airline industry.
But now, let me just get this straight. The economy was in trouble heading into Tuesday.
Not this kind of trouble.
But I mean, it's hard to accept that 5 days of the economy stopping is somehow going to tip it over. And what it basically turns out now politically is it becomes that it's not George Bush's economy, or the Republicans' economy, or anybody else's economy. It's the terrorist economy, and therefore they're the ones you can run against.
Well, we're not talking about running, Mark. For once, let's not talk about running in the election. Let's talk about the American economy and whether this is a great victory for the terrorists who hate capitalism and hate this country.
Bob, I'm sorry. I mean, the idea that this is the capitalist failure brought on by the terrorist act is hard to believe. You accept that, Al?
No, I don't. I don't think that these were people who hate modern life. I mean, they hate women to have rights. They hate democracy. They hate all sorts of things. And the fact that we're a capitalist society just
it's only a piece of it. We are the object of this murderous hate because we are powerful, because we are rich, because we are modern, because we are Christian, because we are good, as President Bush said this week. That's why we're the object of this murderous hate.
We support the right of the State of Israel to exist.
Right. On the day of the terrorist attack, President Bush issued a warning to Afghanistan for playing host to terrorist leader Osama bin Laden.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Elaborated today.
They will try to hide. They will try to avoid the United States and our allies. But we're not going to let them.
The U.S. government came close to identifying Osama bin Laden as the guilty party.
We have not yet identified Osama bin Laden as the direct perpetrator, but the evidence, we have a lot of evidence is mounting, which will allow us to determine in the near future who it is. But he certainly is the leader of that kind of organization.
Meanwhile, members of Congress assailed the CIA for another intelligence failure. Margaret Carlson, is President Bush ready to attack Afghanistan?
Mark, he's ready, as we all are, but he's probably not able at this moment, other than perhaps to drop a few feel-good bombs, because it's not going to be easy. It's going to require ground troops, and it's going to require alliances that we don't yet have. The one thing he said this week, which sets up what has to happen, is if you're not with us, you're against us. There's no middle ground now. And, you know, Pakistan is going to have to become the 51st state, or we're going to treat it as Osama bin Ladenistan. And they're going to be our enemy as well. But to get these alliances so that we can get into Afghanistan and root him out is going to take things we're not good at. That terrain and how he's hidden and how that network operates, as someone said, is a general's nightmare and a guerrilla's dream.
Cato Byrne.
Well, Afghanistan should maybe be made to find him and turn him over to us. I think the president was exactly right, and I think it's exactly what the way the public now views this, and the early signs are our allies certainly agree. You're either with us or against us on this one. So I think we can expect and deserve the kind of cooperation he's going to need. Certainly it's not going to be easy, but look, in the past we've fought terrorism, and we've had a war against terrorism, in case you haven't noticed, for years now, with lawsuits and resolutions and diplomacy. And the polls tell us, and I'm not surprised to see it, that the public is 100% practically in favor of a massive military response to this attack on us.
A massive military response, Bob, but I mean, I come back to what Margaret said. You're talking about troops on the ground. You're talking about occupation. You're not talking about some done at 30,000 feet above, 10 miles away, antiseptically.
Let's try to put this in perspective. Yeah. After all the talk that's gone on all this week, I will bet you there are no terrorist leaders in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. I think they've cleared out of their terrorist camps. Where they are, we don't know. Do we send in the 101st Airborne? Ask the Soviets. The Soviets, not as good as we are, I guess, but they're a pretty good army. They got creamed. Ask the British. A long time ago, they got creamed in Afghanistan. This is not a conventional army like the Iraqis. This is a guerrilla army. Just what do we do? The American peoples are desperate for action. Let's do something. Let's knock them. But what do we do? It is not like getting the Iraqis to move out of Kuwait.
Al Hunt.
I think Bob is too pessimistic. I think we may do something quickly, sort of like a Doolittle raid when we raided Tokyo 6 months after, whatever it was, after Pearl Harbor. That won't mean much. But I think we can. If the Taliban won't turn over Osama bin Laden, I think we'll go get him. And I think we'll send a Delta team in there, and I think we will get him, and I think he'll get him dead or alive, and more likely the former. And that'll be a great victory. We're not trying to occupy Afghanistan. It's different than what the Soviets did in 1979. It won't be the end of this, Mark. It's only the beginning. This will go on. This is a long-term, protracted issue. And I think one of the ultimate goals of this administration, at least major people in this administration, is not to get Osama bin Laden, but to get Saddam Hussein. And that's what's going to become the big picture item here.
Bob made the point about what do you do, and the desire for action, the desire. There is, I mean, revenge is in the air. There's no question about it. I mean, in every measurement of public attitudes, and I've never seen it as high. I mean, that sense of vengeance and how long will that survive? I mean, just from your own experience and your own analysis, how long does it have a shelf life of a month, 6 months, or a year?
Well, until last week, as a matter of principle, this country was willing to commit no ground troops, it seemed, for any reason. A body bag was unacceptable. The tolerance, I don't think it is over, and I think the tolerance is much higher now. I do think you're going to have some successes, however, and not get mired in a country where, as Bob says, neither the Soviets nor the British were able to succeed. But I agree with Al. I think we are going to be able to get him. What we're not going to be able to do is to get the whole network. Right. This is going to be very difficult. This is going to
involve over, we're talking about years. We're not talking about months. We're talking about the loss of a lot of American lives in this over the long run.
Where
we're
talking about lose?
Well, were you in Afghanistan, in the Middle East?
We sent an expeditionary force to Afghanistan.
Bob, if we're going to have a war on terrorism, you have to get them and you have to kill them. I mean, you don't have any other choice. Now, if you want to stop it, but if you do that there are going to be tremendous casualties, and there are going to be retaliations.
Mark, I'm not a military planner, so I'm not exactly sure what our military planners spent much of today planning. I do know this, though. I do think that the people who think that the American public will not stand for casualties really exaggerate the American public concern. Polls showed, Bob, during the Persian Gulf War, people were being told constantly that war was going to cost us thousands of body bags. It thank God, didn't. But the American public still, if they know it is in our interest, and boy, after Tuesday, defending America from future attacks like this, there is every reason to believe the American public will have, I think, a realistic view of what the cost could be.
That isn't the point. The point is, I think American people are willing to suffer, to have their sons and daughters killed.
For a cause they believe in.
But where do they go? That's what I'd like to know. In the 19th century, when the British avenged Chinese Gordon in the Sudan, they knew it took them years to get ready, but they knew where to go. They went into the Sudan. They don't know where to go now.
No place easy we're going to go, whether it's Afghanistan, the Bekaa Valley. It's going to be awful. Bob, but you can't. But if you're going to root out terrorism, well, I did give you a couple places, Bob. But if you're going to root out terrorism, you don't do it by sitting in Washington.
A lot of them are in New Jersey. the terrorists.
Well, then we'll go there.
Okay. Yeah. All right. President Bush did spend much of Tuesday traveling to military installations. He arrived back in Washington that night to address the nation.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat.
2 days later, he was using the word war.
My resolve is steady and strong about winning this war that has been declared on America.
Who? On Friday, he addressed a prayer service at the National Cathedral.
This conflict was begun on the timing and terms of others. It will end in a way and at an hour of our choosing.
When he went to New York later in the day, workers at the World Trade Center said they could not hear the president over his bullhorn.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Kate, how did George W. Bush handle his first really big crisis of his presidency?
Mark, I think he began the week fine, and I think he ended the week in a really strong position, performing even better. I think he completely filled the suit of that office on Friday. I think his speech at the National Cathedral was very effective and a difficult kind of speech to do. And I didn't see him more comfortable all week than in Lower Manhattan with those rescue workers, where he just seemed utterly comfortable talking with those brave individuals. So I think he came through, and the polls certainly seem to indicate the public overwhelmingly agrees. I think he came through the week in a really strong position.
Al Hunt, the president's polls are stratospheric. The question, is it a rally to the flag, and the president is the flag at this point? How strong and reassuring was he earlier in the week, did you think?
Well, of course the polls reflect a rallying around, and the same thing happened with his dad back in 1991. I don't quite agree with Kate. I think he showed that what we already knew, that he's not a Reagan, that he's not a Roosevelt, and he's never going to be. But I'll tell you something, Mark, a year from now, if we have done away with Osama bin Laden, we have terrorism on the run, he's kept together a very important international coalition. Doesn't matter how he did this week. And on the other hand, if terrorism has us on the run a year from now, it also doesn't matter how he did this week. He's going to be judged by deeds, not words.
Bob Novak.
I think he was off to a shaky start on the first day, because if you listen to the security people, if you listen to the Secret Service, they'll never let you do anything. I don't think he would even come back.
The flying
around, going to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. I don't think they would even let him come back that night. I know he wanted to come back immediately, but they said Air Force One was being threatened. And that is the problem for any president. At the time of the Bay of Pigs, I'm sorry, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they wanted Kennedy to go out to Camp David, and he refused to do so. But I thought the president ended up very well, but the American people really do gather around a president, and I think the if that Al mentioned, if Osama bin Laden is in custody or killed,
and terrorism is
killed, then he's a great hero.
Yeah.
But this is an enormously high hurdle.
Margaret Carlson.
It helps that we're all rooting for him, because you're just kind of push him through those speeches and make it good, because we all want to feel reassured. It was a bad beginning. I thought the phone call with Rudy Giuliani was particularly bad, not just because he was wandering around on the phone, but Rudy Giuliani had proved himself to be a great leader this week. And, I mean, somebody called him Churchill in a Yankee cap. He was FDR in a fire jacket. He was everywhere, and he was in charge. And he gets to leave office on a grace note as a result of it.
He does. He should.
But I agree with Kate. When he got to Lower Manhattan and he was standing with his arm around the firefighter in the midst of the pipe fitters and the steel workers and the rescue workers, and thanked them for all of us, because they did keep the country together. He was at home among those heroes.
All week he was totally authentic.
Heroes.
And don't forget, he's president. Had he been governor of Texas in a like position as Rudy Giuliani, he might well have been operating differently.
You know what I thought was...
Let me say, what a difference a week makes. A week ago, the cover of Time magazine, whatever happened to Colin Powell. I think Colin Powell was seen. Colin Powell, Don Rumsfeld, seasoned team around him, and all the rest of it. Where was Dick Cheney?
That was what I was going to say.
Where was Dick Cheney?
The most humiliating thing about this week was on Thursday morning, they sent the vice president to Camp David because they didn't want the president and the vice president together in Washington. Now, that is another victory for terrorism, and we haven't heard of him because he's out for safekeeping in Camp David. That is when you listen to the security people, you make bad.
We didn't hear from the first 3 days.
People, I mean, I am so stunned that these people will do. They're so experienced. I mean, I agree with you totally. But why does a Dick Cheney not say no?
You disagree with me?
No, I agree with you totally. I'm wondering.
My question is, where was he the first 3 days? I mean, why? I mean, if you're looking for reassurance, what the country is looking for, I mean, Karen Hughes is not reassurance. I mean, she's a counselor to the president. Why wasn't the vice president?
When Bush was in that bunker, Cheney should have been on TV at the White House, and his absence is mysterious.
That would have made the president look bad.
That's exactly why.
I agree with that.
He was instrumental in all the deliberations, but I think he decided purposely not to upstage.
He shouldn't be at Camp David now, though.
He turned into a non-person.
He should not be out of sight.
I mean, I saw more Paul Wolfowitz than I saw him.
I also want to add my voice to Don Rumsfeld. I thought behaved incredibly well at the Pentagon. He tended to the casualties over there. He was in charge, and I thought it was a very impressive performance for the Secretary of Defense.
All right, Newsmaker of the Week is Democratic Congressman Robert Matsui of California. Robert Matsui, age 59, residence Sacramento, California, religion Methodist. He's a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and the Hastings College of Law in California. Sacramento City Council member for 8 years, elected to the United States Congress in 1978. Al Hunt sat down with Congressman Robert Matsui earlier this week.
Congressman, after Pearl Harbor, Americans rallied around a great cause. The one sour note was the anti-Japanese American hysteria. As a child, you were interned in one of those infamous camps. Do you have any fears today that there's a similar reaction to Arab Americans?
I don't think there's any question that we would never see an internment camp situation again. I think there are too many good Americans who have the history of what happened and would never let that happen. But a prelude to the internment camps right after Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of vandalism against Japanese American stores that had anything symbolizing Japan, like grocery stores that might have sold Japanese products. And there was a lot of race baiting. We're seeing that now.
We sure are. In Gary, Indiana, a gas station attendant who happens to be of Arab descent, window shot out, 300 people marched on a mosque in Chicago. Jim Zogby, the head of the Arab League, says he's getting death threats.
It's a real dangerous situation. Thank goodness President Bush, former President Clinton, all the major elected officials have been saying we need to temper our remarks. The danger is, of course, the public out there who may not be able to distinguish between somebody who happens to be an Arab American or a Muslim and what people perceive to be the terrorist.
But you make a very interesting point about the political leaders because back in 1942, it was Earl Warren and Franklin Roosevelt, two of the great liberal heroes who orchestrated the internment camps, and the Supreme Court, and what should have been unconstitutional on its face, ruled 6-3 it was constitutional.
That's right, and that's why I think you would never see anything as extreme as the internment camp, but there are significant sporadic events of beatings of Arab Americans and vandalism of their property, and we need to speak out on this.
Congressman, on the issue of ethnic profiling, there are many calls for far more vigilance of people of Arab descent who are boarding airplanes, for instance. Is that legitimate?
I think it's always legitimate from a law enforcement tool that if a certain group of ethnic individual has been accused of committing a crime, that you've got to look for that person, you've got to describe that person. But a random stopping of people of the Arab Americans would be certainly intolerable, and that should be a violation of the Constitution of the United States.
The Bremer Commission report on terrorism last year recommended there be much more intense tracking of foreign students studying here in America, with a particular emphasis, I think, on Arab students. So the government would know, for example, if a student switched majors from English to physics. Should we do something like that?
No, in fact, I think that would be something that I would find to be somewhat intolerable. That's somewhat what happened to Japanese Americans. There was a belief, there was no espionage, there was no case of disloyalty among Japanese Americans, but there was a belief that Japanese Americans would be loyal to Japan. And so basically they profiled all 120,000 Japanese Americans that happen to live in the United States. My mother and father, they were in their early 20s, and I was 6 months old. And there's no way that I was a security risk, nor would my parents, because they were both born in Sacramento, California, actually, and they lost everything. And the real fear I have is that when you're attacked like this in a time of international crisis, when your country is being threatened, there's an issue of questioning one's loyalty. And when one is branded a potential enemy to one's country, I think that has some deep implications. It's a scar that really never heals. When I hear Pearl Harbor, as some were relating the last few days to Pearl Harbor, it made me shudder somewhat. Even though I had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor, I was 6 months old when 3 months old when Pearl Harbor happened.
Al Hunt, do you share Congressman Bob Matsui's stated concerns that Arab Americans are in for really a tough time legally and constitutionally?
Unfortunately, and socially.
Socially?
I do, Mark. Bob Matsui is a product of one of the most disgraceful chapters in American history. He was 6 months old. He was thrown into an internment camp solely because he was a Japanese American, didn't get out till he was 4 1/2. And I think that's not going to happen today to Arab Americans, but when we hear about Arab American gas station owners their windows being shot out, people storming mosques, hate crimes being threatened, I think that's a real. There are 4 million Arab Americans, and they're very loyal, patriotic people.
Bob Novak.
Well, for one of the few times, I have to agree 100% with my colleague, Mr. Hunt. It worries me very much, and there is a deeper problem, is that when all of us will get on planes again soon, and we look in the plane and we see an Arab American on the plane, how do we feel? Right. Do we feel, oh my God, this is it? And that is racial profiling, not by the government, but by the individual citizen. And I'm afraid it's unavoidable.
Let me just speak up in favor of some profiling, because I think some profiling is in order. I do not believe American civil liberties would be jeopardized, of any origin, including Arab Americans, if we profiled foreign nationals in this country. That's what we're talking about. These were foreign nationals. And in the reaction to this, airports and security guards are going to act as though Susie Applegate getting on a flight with a car seat and a baby stroller is as likely to be a murderous lunatic as the guy behind her online who is a foreign national on a passport from Syria. And that shouldn't happen to American citizens when there are things we know about the kind of people who perpetuated this, and they're not Americans. They're not citizens of this country, and they ought to be watched more closely.
You know, the way we can reduce our own internal profiling, which we do when we get on an airplane, is if someone else is doing some of what Kate says. The FBI only had 2 of those hijackers in their sights, and one of them was bragging at a strip joint in Florida the night before he flew that plane into the Twin Tower, into the World Trade Center, that there was going to be blood flowing the next day, and he was giving chapter and verse, and no one knew about it. So the FBI is going to have to do a better job here, but we're not a country that would intern anybody these days.
But we start down that road of racial profiling after Oklahoma City. Yep. Should we racially profile young right-wing Christian men because they were members of the militia? They blew up Oklahoma City.
I'm talking about foreign nationals traveling from countries with a track record of producing these kinds of people.
The most dangerous have been militia types. We don't want to racially profile them.
But it's going to make a very unhappy time for a lot of innocent, not foreign nationals,
right?
But Arab Americans with an accent.
And I will say one thing: when the Shields came to this country, they were foreign nationals too. And
these people are not seeking citizenship, Mark. They are not seeking citizenship.
A lot of Arab Americans are. I mean,
and
that goes back to Margaret's point.
They're American citizens.
Specifically following those who are identified as troublemakers. Beyond the Beltway looks at the reaction of the terrorist attack on America by the Arab world and Islam. The Saudi Arabian ambassador to Washington described his conversations with senior U.S. officials. Sorry, we
offered full support fighting terrorism and cooperation with all other friends around the world to help expose those perpetrators.
But the Taliban leaders in Afghanistan issued a warning.
If neighboring or regional countries, particularly Islamic countries, gave a positive response to American demand for military bases, it would spark up extraordinary danger. Similarly, if any neighboring country gave territorial way or airspace to USA against our land, it would draw us into an imposed war.
Joining us now from London is CNN's chief international correspondent, Christiane Amanpour. Thank you for coming in at this late hour, Christiane. Christiane, can the Saudis and the... Thank you. Tell us, can the Saudis and the Pakistanis, can they stand up to the pressure from the Taliban?
Yeah, well, most military analysts don't give the Taliban any chance at all as a military force against any of those countries, against any of its neighbors. What those countries are more concerned about is political pressure from Muslims in their own countries. Both in Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia, there are, extremist Islamic groups who have constantly been putting pressure throughout the years on their political leadership. So that's the bigger concern. But I think you'll find that both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia will do pretty much as they can to accede to what the United States has asked for. They may sort of look for sort of wiggle clauses in public, for the public opinion, not wanting their publics to know exactly the extent of what they're doing, but nonetheless cooperating, as for instance Saudi Arabia has, not only in the Gulf War, but in the years that have followed with U.S. military bases and military action in the Middle East since then. And the United Arab Emirates, which is the only other country that recognizes the Taliban, has today said that it is reviewing its relationship with that militia.
Now, just one question further, and that is, if in fact the United States did initiate military action against the home office of the Taliban, is there enough indigenous Taliban support, sympathizers, ideological kindred souls in Saudi Arabia to threaten destabilization there?
Well, it's hard to tell because it's not really the Taliban that have the support in any of these countries. It's more the people who are around Osama bin Laden. He basically has what you might term as a foreign legion of supporters in Afghanistan. People who've come throughout the Soviet occupation from Algeria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all sorts of Muslim countries. And those are the people who are the ones that have gone back to their countries and to other countries as far afield as Bosnia, Chechnya, Kashmir, and sort of taken the Islamic struggle. So it's more those kind of people rather than the indigenous Afghanis.
Okay. Bob Novak.
Christiane, do I gather you are optimistic about the ability of President Bush to put together the same kind of coalition that his father formed?
Well, I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. I'm just looking at what is coming out of the capitals since President Bush has, and Secretary of State Colin Powell have been talking about this coalition. And it is, so far, very much in terms of rhetoric at least, almost unanimous support. And I've been looking through a country list of those who have been pledging support, political support, military support. There seems to be an overwhelming desire to help the United States. I think that it'll be, in terms of action, a different action than what the first President Bush had to do. I don't believe that people are thinking about a full-scale, military invasion of Afghanistan. I think there will probably be military action, but I think it'll require, according to what foreign leaders are saying right now, a much more sophisticated and sustained country-by-country, almost detective and financial and all sorts of, multi-pronged efforts to, take the head off what they call this terrorist monster.
Margaret Carlson.
Christiane, I'm wondering if the assassination of Massoud was connected in any way to the recent to the hijackers attacking America, and whether there's any chance of overcoming the Taliban in Afghanistan now that he's gone.
Well, that is a really good question. I mean, Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Northern Alliance controlled about 5% of the territory in the northeast part by the end of the day. Basically, for a while, those lines had been stable. Neither the Taliban could get that last remaining piece of territory, nor could the Northern Alliance push back in any significant fashion. There were only very small shifts of the balance of power there. Did his assassination have anything to do with it? I just don't know. But certainly they're saying that the people who did that were perhaps Algerians who had come and got visas, apparently, through the Pakistan embassy in London and gone out and posed as journalists and done what they did. And it's certainly going to take away a huge basically military planning and the leadership of the Northern Alliance, because Ahmad Shah Massoud is not only the charismatic leader of the resistance to the Taliban, but really known as the local mastermind and the architect of the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan. I mean, he was considered really a formidable foe.
Okay. Cato Byrne.
Christiane, about our European allies, this week a French editorial writer told his fellow countrymen, "We are all Americans." How long is that welcome solidarity likely to last?
Well, I think that the thing that I've been most bowled over by is the extent to which there has been solidarity, not just sympathy and shock, which is almost universal around the world, but solidarity, and it has been demonstrated in a way that should make those people who did it know that they are almost entirely isolated, because it's not just Europe, it is all the mainstream Muslim communities in the Middle East have come out and said that this is against Islam. In Iran, an unprecedented joint declaration by the hardliners and reformists condemning this, and there was even a moment of silence at a football match there. In Russia, in Yemen, in all the places, the most unusual suspects, if you like, have condemned this. In Europe, I think they are very conscious that this is not just an American problem. Yes, the attack was directed at America, and make no mistake about it. But there are also extremist groups operating in Europe, threatening the European capitals and threatening the stability there. And they know that this is something that they have to get to grips with.
Go ahead, Christiane.
Christiane, how central is Osama bin Laden to this terrorist network? If he were eliminated, would it be the beginning of the end of the international terrorist network, or would there just be many others to fill the void?
Well, experts say that it probably wouldn't end it completely, but it would do a lot to disrupt it. And disrupting is very important, and that it would take more than just eliminating one person. It would have to be eliminating the ability of his key lieutenants and aides and that sort of top level of that structure. And they believe that if they can disrupt it enough, they can at least buy some time while they try to do what they've said that they want to do, and that is conduct a sustained campaign against this, which is going to really have to be waged at every level. It is exceptionally complicated when it comes to financial support, the ability to forge travel documents, which is apparently quite easy in some European countries. I mean, there are so many elements to this that the leaders say require really sustained and multi-pronged effort.
Christiane Amanpour, thank you so much for your contributions, for your insight, and just for your all-around perceptions and perspective. Thank you very much. And now it's time for us for the outrage of the week. This week we saw the face of heroism in New York City. At last count, 265 New York firefighters were missing and presumed dead. These were the brave who chose to risk and ultimately to lose their lives to save the lives of strangers they had never met. In the hour of maximum peril, each firefighter was truly the captain of his own soul. Let it be noted that each was also a public employee. This week, we also saw the ugly underside of the private sector. When all flights were canceled Tuesday, the Sheraton Airport at New York's JFK Airport immediately doubled its room rates. Profit and greed were sadly written in blood and tears. Bob Novak.
In yesterday's Boston Herald, Democratic Congressman Marty Meehan was quoted as doubting that President Bush sought safety Tuesday for valid security reasons. Quote, "I don't buy the notion Air Force One was a target. That's just PR. That's just spin," unquote. That caused so much commotion that a police guard was posted outside the congressman's office. Meehan said he was misrepresented, but added that he regretted making the comments. And well, he should. There finally comes a time when Bush bashing is not appropriate.
Margaret Carlson.
TV evangelist Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson have blamed two